The story begins with a letter. There are just 3 lines. It is addressed to author, author Darrell himself. The letter sounds anonymous, and it's not important as to who has written this letter, right? But the contents, these 3 lines, sets the tone, of the story. Now, what the letter states is that a particular family is facing some inconveniences because of, rhesus monkey. It is causing a lot of damage and trouble, and the mother is already suffering and she's bedridden. The doctors were called in to take care of her health. So, though it sounds incomplete, in fact, what we can sense is Darrell happens to be the last resort to people who have problems when it comes to animals. And they rely on author to get any sort of help. So this letter is more a kind of a foreshadowing, a kind of a prediction that sets the mood, sets the tone of the text. So let's start reading further this story. It was towards the end of the second year that I decided that the zoo, not being well established, must cease to be a mere showplace of animals and start to contribute something towards the conservation of wildlife. I felt that it would be essential gradually to weed out all the commoner animals in the collection and to replace them with rare and threatened species, that is, species which were threatened with extinction in the wild state. Now, there is a clear indication of what are his priorities, that these zoos must cease to be mere showplace of animals and they should be replaced with something rare, and especially the threatened species. Now, this is something to be underlined. This is something very important. What could be, you think, the possible reason for gorillas to be pushed to extinction? There are ample reasons, but the author is caught up with a problem. His idea was to replace common animals to the rare, the endangered ones. So this is how, the idea begins, helping out these animals. Let's begin reading the story. I was wondering which of this massive list of endangered species we could start with when the decision was taken out of my hands. An animal dealer telephoned and asked me if I wanted a baby gorilla. So just when he was caught up in this dilemma, unable to choose as to which animal to start with in terms of conservation, just then the decision was taken out of the hands of the author, as a dealer calls him up, informing the author about the availability of a baby gorilla. Now, did he make this decision that he would go for gorilla? In fact, definitely no. It's the situation that led to this decision. So finally, the decision is made. Now we move on to the next paragraph. Gorillas have been exceptionally numerous as a species, and with the state that Africa was in, at that moment it seemed to me that they might well become extinct within the next 25 years. Now, this is important. He starts talking about the state that Africa was in and what would happen to gorillas in the next 20 years. So it is here that, the author moves on to talk about something that people would generally avoid as authors. He starts talking about government and its role in animal conservation in case if they have a role to play in. So this story, if we talk about this story, though it is depicted in a very light manner, it's no doubt a comical account or a serious assessment or an evaluation of our society, of our government or the organization insofar as their commitment towards animal conservation that is concerned. But he is very clear, as in, if we don't act, very soon gorillas and many other animals too would be on the verge of extinct. So later, the author inquires with this animal dealer as to what is the price that he would fix for this gorilla, and it happens to be that would cost him 1,200 pounds. And just when he heard this amount, there is a vision of his bank manager's face that is reflected, which shows that definitely this was a too huge amount for an author to buy a baby gorilla. Interestingly, what happens here is the author gives an opportunity to know about these animals dealers as to how serious they are about this business, and do they actually know anything about animals at all. You may read the lines. In my experience, the average animal dealer can with difficulty distinguish between a bird, a reptile, and a mammal, but this is about the extent of his zoological knowledge. Of course, this is a wonderful piece of sarcasm here. However, he has decided that he would go ahead, and the narrator then agrees, and then we have a very domestic kind of a discussion between author and his wife Jackie. We have one more character introduced here, and she happens to be quite practical than author, who is more emotional about bringing this baby gorilla, and she too finds this amount to be too huge one, right? And further the discussion continues as to whether they could afford this gorilla. In fact, I believe that certain practicalities are something to be thought about, and Jackie uh, wasn't wrong in her apprehensions, right? And obviously, she asked as to where would author come up with such a huge money, to which the author says that I shall get this money from other sources. And further, he says that don't you realize that this island is infested with rich people who do nothing all day long but revolve around from one cocktail party to another? Now, this is a serious critique of society, a wonderful line. I believe this is an assessment of the mentality of the affluent class, and I would say their role that they can play in the conservation of wildlife. Further, the author goes to an extent to say that I think it's time that they made a contribution towards animal conservation. I shall ask them to contribute the money. Jackie feels this idea to be stupid, and she's not too optimistic the way the author is, right? And so the author calls up his friend named Hope. I believe, I don't know for what reason author names this character as Hope. Probably it's not no allegory here, but again it represents that there's something good that would come out from this person. So the kind of help that author exactly wanted from his friend Hope is he wanted to in fact to have the list of all the richest people that were there on this island. I would say this sounds a little weird, but this was an excellent, very good idea. I would say he's giving an opportunity to this affluent class, to be the part of this noble cause to help the endangered species, and they could be generous enough in giving some amount that he wanted to buy this baby gorilla. So what happens next is he believes that in case if they have these breeding colonies like gorillas, if they aren't established in captivity soon, then there won't be anyone left, and surely these people should realize this. Now this statement happens to be so important, made by author as citizens. He considers, and I believe that it's our responsibility to be the part of the ecological issues, and in fact solve them in whatever way that was possible. Again, Hope is not sure with this idea, And to author's response, Hope says that I'm afraid the average person either does not or couldn't care less. Now, this is again a good piece of criticism. Again, this is a very another serious critique on of society about average class people like us. We are so much indulged into our own lives, and we have become so self-centered that we cease to look around and see the other problems, the other issues. But the author is very optimistic about it, and he thinks of giving it worth a try. So half an hour later, Hope dictated a list of about 50 people over the telephone, right? And this is how the mission begins. Surprisingly, by lunchtime, after having called so many people, in fact, our author is lucky enough to collect around 200 pounds, and just only another 100 to go to get his own gorilla. So it was a great beginning, what seemed to be a bit weird, which was thought by Jackie and Hope to begin with. Luckily, one of the person from the list that Hope had given out of these 50 people, a person named Major Domo, he responds too positively to our author, and he is ready to donate around 1,000 pounds, and this was the biggest, in fact, donation, to be too generous enough for this noble cause. So finally the day comes wherein the author is anxious enough to look at this gorilla, which he was a little apprehensive as to whether it would be gorilla, chimpanzee, knowing that the dealers that he's dealing in aren't too sure about their business, and they're not sure more about basic information about animals. So finally, it's here in the airport that the first encounter happens here, and the dealer walks in, he opens the door, and this is how Napongo, in fact no should be silent here, we can call it as Pongo, comes into the life of author. Let's quickly check in the details of Pongo here. He's around 18 inches high, quite handsome, in fact healthy looking, with solid bone and muscle. He was strolling around in the room, and it seemed that he had held up his arms to be lifted up. He had this light chocolatey colored fur which was thick and soft. His skin was soft and glossy as patent leather. His eyes were small. In fact, the author has given all the minute details to give us a beautiful picture of how would a healthy gorilla, baby gorilla, look like. And in no time, in fact, these two developed a kind of a bond. I would say a remarkable ease shown by Pongo, especially in taking his new master with absolutely no fuss at all. In fact, this is quite a different way other animals behave when they are handed over to new masters. They are mostly not willing to accept this change. I believe it's not only with animals, it's the same with human beings as well. We take time to gel around with strangers. So this rapport between the two developed too easily with no extra effort to be put in. So the author pays the amount, and the two depart to take a flight to Jersey and come back home. So the next part of the story is what happens when the author brings Pongo back home. So why home? Why he didn't go directly to the zoo? In fact, because his cage wasn't still ready, Pongo was to be kept in the guest room, and that is how we have this title gorilla in the guest room. So this appears to be a little difficult and a dangerous one, yeah, to keep wild animals in your home, right? But in no time Pongo won over both, in fact, Daryl's mother and his wife Jackie, and not only these two family members but the staff of the zoo as well. And all of these people took so much care, uh, and they showed so much love that makes this story an interesting read. But our author, on the other hand, was quite cautious about Pongo, and he was not ready to take any risk as he had a very bad, very unpleasant past experience of keeping a chimpanzee as a guest earlier. In fact, chimpanzee named Chumley had destroyed not only the author's house and its decor, but had made the life of his entire family a big hell. So this time, Daryl was more vigilant not to repeat his mistake. However, Daryl's this new guest, unlike Chumley, was well behaved, in fact, well mannered, and did not fiddle with anything, did not mess around with things at home. And Daryl was immensely, in fact, impressed with his guest's beautiful behavior. In fact, he goes to an extent saying that Pongo's behavior was an exemplary, a classic example of well behaved gorilla. And the author was surprised to find out that his mother was trying her best to persuade him to keep Pongo in the house permanently, but the author had his reservations and put aside his mother's pleas. The author goes to an extent to say that there is no doubt relatively the mannerism or the good manners of Pongo was definitely good in comparison to other gorillas, but what more can you expect from an animal basically, though trained? So in fact, page 78 and 79 talks about how the traces of his the signs of his presence at author's guest room was visible around in form of a scarlet map drawn on the walls, or could be a tin of raspberries spread around the dirty floors, the door handle, the broken door handle. So there are enough of evidences wherein we see we find issues related to the existence between the animal and the humans. So it is time wherein the author moves on to say that within just a short period of 12 months, Pongo had almost doubled his size. And no more is he that small baby gorilla that one could carry like a small baby and move around. Now it was, in fact, a huge one, and it was time to give company of his own kind and of animals too. So it is with this view that author Daryl starts thinking of providing him a mate. Now page 81, the very first paragraph is something very, very important. As we had mentioned earlier, this piece of literature happens to go into a category of eco-critical literature, which talks about ecological issues. And we do have here a wonderful, critique of organization here regarding the wildlife conservation. So it's not only that we are expected to take care to provide food and shelter to the rare and endangered species. What is important is they need a mate. So I read the first paragraph of page 81, wherein the author makes it very clear that, if an adult, animal isn't provided or deprived of company of its own, it would degenerate, right? It would be lonely, and this would be very disturbing for author to see it. And again, the first paragraph is a wonderful piece of criticism, which talks about issues regarding wildlife conservation, right? It is a serious matter, and it very clearly states in this line wherein he says that, including, which is put into bracket, including some that had ample resources for providing a mate. I thought the time had come to try to procure a wife for Pongo, even though I knew that our funds would probably not stretch that far. Interestingly, if we have observed time and again in this entire text, we see Darrell, coming up with subtle attacks. It's not so obvious enough. You need to be careful enough to check it out and try to read between the lines. He makes it very clear, attacking society, institutions, or governments, and especially regarding the financial issues that he has. So it's not that he should be the sole person responsible to manage the funding when it comes to wildlife conservation. And what he, in fact, if we look at the nature of Darrell's writing, not only this text but various other texts, it does talk about, maybe the possible corruption or the issues of funds related to zoos, could be issues with mismanagement of these funds. But he does make it very clear that it was difficult for him to acquire these two rare gorillas. The first time it was Pongo, and the next time when he goes to get a wife for Pongo. So the time has come for us to introduce to the new gorilla. Again, she happens to be this rare gorilla, this species. Let's introduce this new character of our story. She's named Nendi. She is a female gorilla, but unlike Pongo and his bond, his relationship with Darrell, Nendi has a different story, different past, and I would say a very unpleasant, ill-fated past. This again is just not addition that Darrell puts into his description. This is also a kind of which provides as readers a window as to the description of the sufferings that these animals in wild are subjected to. So Darrell makes it very clear by portraying the character of Nendi that she's an example of that irresponsible behavior, or the human greed, or the human involvement into the lives of wild animals, which leads to so much of suffering, which leads to so much of trauma. So Nendi is a relationship with either Darrell or Pongo or the other members that we find in this zoo would be a bit challenging, unlike Pongo, who comes in form of a small baby, so it becomes very easy to tackle Pongo in comparison to Nendi, who has a very unpleasant past, and her relationship with humans wasn't, in fact, her encounter with humans in wild wasn't a happy episode. So she would take time to build that rapport in the zoo. Now, of course, Nendi took much time to, in fact, have that confidence, that trust. But before she could gain that trust. Page 82, I would like to read as to what made her more antisocial in nature. The very first paragraph, I would read it. It must have been a glancing blow, or her skull would have been split in two. With such an introduction to the human race, you would hardly blame Nandi for being a little anti-social. So unlike Pongo, who's friendly, Nandi has a past. So we move on to the interesting part of the story. Nandi is brought on an installment base, just like Pongo when he was brought. In fact, author goes to an extent of raising funds. This time, he gets Nandi on the installment basis. Fine. Now the most important part of the story: how to familiarize these two, animals. One who is tamed and the other who is wild enough. All right. Nandi is somebody who needs to be taken a very special care. Now, when we talk about animals, right, fine, the decision was made by the people in the zoo that they need to familiarize the two animals, right? They need to be put into the same cage. Initially, Nandi was put in a different cage, just next to Pongo, just to have. It was an opportunity wherein she could just look around and find a familiar face of her own kind. And later, after some time, she was put into that same cage with Pongo. So when we talk about animals, they're very territorial in the nature. They have power issues, especially when you have two strong animals. So the next information that we have in the text is a bit of humor, yet very interesting, right? So what we see is the entire all the people in the zoo. They are anxious, they're scared, they're excited, they are ready with buckets of water and all the things needed for emergency in case if things turn out to be wild. Right? They were prepared to come across a situation wherein maybe the two would end up hurting one another. But these two gorillas get along well, and very soon they end up being good friends. The next part of the story, we move on to Pongo's illness, and this part of the story is a little disturbing for the readers and the author as well. So I would read out page 86, the second paragraph. Then came Pongo's first real illness. I had just arranged to spend 3 weeks in the south of France, which was to be a sort of working holiday, for we were to be accompanied by a BBC producer whom I hoped to convince of the necessity for making a film about life in the Camargue. So he was about to leave just before few weeks that Pongo fell ill. Now, just prior to his departure, we see Pongo suffering, and he starts showing some signs of illness to such an extent that he starts losing weight. He refuses to drink, to eat anything or to drink anything. He has severe diarrhea, and because he starts losing weight, and that too very rapidly, it was a matter of a concern. And the author is also put into a dilemma wherein he was just supposed to leave to south of France, and it was at this crucial time that Pongo seems to be helpless and suffering. The next part of the description by Darrell is really interesting. It's not just a boring piece of information as to animal and their illness, but he deals it in such a human way, I would say, that it makes an interesting read. Just as we would take care of any family member when they are sick, we try to go to any extent to see to it that they are back again well in shape. Darrell and his family go to all the extent to see to it that Pongo comes back to life and he is back to what he is, his usual form. So I would like to read here page 87 and the very first paragraph, wherein the author and his wife Jackie, they decide to go to the market and buy some exotic fruits and vegetables. Right now, this was just an effort to bring back Pongo's appetite. It was an attempt to make him eat something. Back at zoo, he kept on throwing one after the other food that was offered, and it was difficult for Darrell and Jackie to choose as to what would he like, which would be more a kind of a variety of food rather than his normal diet. So look at the love that they have for animals kept in their wildlife. They brought out of season delicacies that costed them a small fortune, especially when they always had issues with their finances. All right, now they come back home loaded with these exotic fruits and vegetables, and suddenly an utter surprise that after rejecting almost everything, right, every trial was, every effort was being made to see to it that Pongo has something, right from, rubbing despairing on his gums to offering, skimmed milk. He could take just a couple of gulps and then he would wash out. In fact, all the exotic fruits and vegetables that were brought were given to him, but he refused them. Just then, they cut a slice of watermelon that they had brought, and for the first time, Pongo displayed signs of interest. He prodded the slice with his finger and leaned forward to smell it carefully. This was the most exciting part. That they were happy to see him, that he in fact took something. The next minute he had the slice in his hands and to our great delight started to eat. But we did not become too jubilant, for we knew that the watermelon contained practically no nutriment, but at least it had aroused his interest in food again. So, an interesting narration of how everybody makes an effort to see to it that he has, some food, and luckily, it's effort, collective effort that is put by everybody, and he's back to the track of good health. And the story ends with the narrator departing, having at the back of his mind a kind of a satisfaction that the health of the gorillas is something that he need not worry, and at the same time, the responsibility that he had taken to the conservation of wildlife was something that he took the utmost care of. He, in fact, did not neglect his duty. Since environmental concerns have increased across all society, I believe that wildlife conservation has become a significant social issue, and it is through this story that he tries to, in fact, you know get public attention. He also tries to expand the human awareness of wildlife conservation. Darrell's writing is more a kind of a sympathetic treatment that he gives to these two gorillas, which is very obvious in our story. And it is this style, I believe, that makes the text more appealing to the readers. Before I end, needless to say, at the end of the story, although these two gorillas are just the representation of all the endangered species, what is interesting that Pongo isn't just shown as a specimen, but his treatment is more like an individual.